News 8 and 11 with Phil Sanchez.
Welcome back. A study from the University of Florida suggests that having too many candidates in an election can cause voters to not turn out for said election. For tonight's Unfiltered, we're discussing this with two members of Indiana's best political team, Kip Tu and Allie Bartlett. Good to see you both. Let's start with both of your respective parties, okay? And Allie, we'll go to you first because I think we've seen this in both parties. Now, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think the study is interesting, obviously noting that it was not based off data collected in the United States, so the election structure is a little bit different. But we've seen scenarios in both parties where we have broad primary fields and narrow primary fields. I mean, the Republican Party is seeing that right now with our gubernatorial field, and then a very small field just with one candidate with Senator Jim Banks, future Senator Jim Banks, I'll say that. And so I don't know that I've seen impacts on turnout necessarily correlate, but I also haven't looked at it very closely. I think when you have a really strong candidate, you can get the party to rally around one person like Jim Banks. But there's also good opportunity for several good candidates to be out there sharing their messages and honing their positions like in our gubernatorial primary.
Kip, your thoughts on this study?
Well, I actually agree with Allie with respect to it was based on data in Brazil where there's mandatory voting. We don't have that in the United States of America, so it's a little bit specious, I think, to grab the data off of a foreign country with respect to that. One thing I will say that in the United States, especially when it comes to presidential primaries, we have a winnowing sort of procedure where, the calendar sort of determines some of this. You have the Iowa caucuses, then New Hampshire, and then South Carolina, and it goes on. And that natural process sort of winnows candidates down at the presidential level, so you don't have, except in Iowa and New Hampshire and maybe South Carolina, a whole bunch of folks in. And I've not seen that the Iowa caucuses, for example, or the New Hampshire primary, where there have been quite a few candidates, that turnout is lower. To me, what I've noticed, not just at the presidential level, but at the local level, it's a lack of knowledge of who the candidates are. For example, when we had elections for judges in Marion County, and we do in other counties as well, people don't know a lot about it, and it's really just a name ID contest. Folks tend to shy away from expressing their preference because they really don't have one, because they don't know who to prefer, because there's no real data or there's no real information out on those candidates. That's when you have lower turnout. Whereas, like Allie said, when you have high information or you have a candidate who's very popular, that does tend to increase turnout. Like what we saw in 2008 with Barack Obama in the state of Indiana, we really juiced the turnout both in the primary and in the general election on our side because he was such a popular figure.
I was going to ask you, from a different perspective, would this maybe having more candidates have a candidate run a better campaign, or on the flip side of that, maybe be a little bit louder than the rest? Allie?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, right? So I think, we can look at this from a couple of different levels. You look at the presidential primaries. I don't think that there's necessarily motivation amongst candidates like that to change their messaging based on the number of candidates in the field. But I think, maybe on a slightly smaller level, when you're looking at things like a gubernatorial primary, this is a real opportunity for these candidates on the Republican side to share their individual platform perspectives and hope to gain votes that way. Like I said, I think there are exceptions to that. I think in general, it's great to have different perspectives to give voters options. But, then there's exceptions for extremely popular candidates like, Congressman Jim Banks in his race, where the party kind of coalesced around one person before the primary. And so I think there's pros and cons to both. But in the end, I do think having options like we're seeing right now will be productive. Because we can see kind of the compare and contrast between some candidates you might otherwise view as similar.
Kip, do you like having more candidates?
Let me just say, she said it 3 times about Jim Banks. I don't know if she's auditioning for a role in the campaign or what, but we got a long way to go.
I'm just using it as an example. We have 2 major elections going on in the state right now.
We got a long time before Jim Banks is anointed and senator, and we'll wait and see how that turns out.
Well,
I will say,
but we can obviously have a conversation about the two major elections happening in the state right now, which are the governor's primary and a senator race. So that's, what we're going to talk about.
Bill, I would say your question is an interesting one. And I do believe that there are instances where the number of candidates causes, I disagree with Allie, where the number of candidates can cause someone to change their potential strategy or behavior based upon the number of candidates, simply because you have to figure out how to outmaneuver that many candidates and how to maybe negotiate your way around some of those candidates. You're watching that unfold in the Republican presidential primary right now. With all the candidates that have announced, you've seen some engage in behavior they might not have engaged in otherwise. You have Chris Christie going right at Donald Trump and trying to stand out in that primary as the alternative to Donald Trump, and everybody else is kind of not figuring what they want to do with respect to that.
All right. Well, good conversation to you both. Thank you for joining us. I know it's a little bit different than our weekly Sunday conversations, but we look forward to maybe having you guys on for Unfiltered in the future as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.